Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness surrounding Savage River State Forest in western Maryland, where the Appalachian Mountains cast their dark shadows over forgotten valleys and ancient streams. It was supposed to be a celebration. My promotion to Senior Marketing Director at Hartwell & Associates had finally come through after 3 grueling years of 80-hour weeks and backstabbing office politics. My closest work friends, Marcus Chen from IT, Sarah Rodriguez from accounting, and Tom Baker from sales, had insisted we needed to properly commemorate the occasion. "You need to decompress," Sarah had said, her warm brown eyes filled with genuine concern. "When's the last time you actually left the city?" I couldn't remember. That's how we ended up driving Marcus's oversized SUV through the winding mountain roads of Garrett County on a crisp October Friday, heading toward a backcountry camping spot Tom claimed to know from his college days. The autumn foliage was spectacular. Brilliant oranges and deep crimsons painted across the hillsides like nature's own funeral shroud, though I didn't think of it that way at the time. "Turn left at the old covered bridge," Tom called out from the passenger seat, consulting a hand-drawn map that looked like it had been folded and refolded 1,000 times. Then we follow Savage River Road for about 8 miles until we hit the trailhead. Marcus, always the cautious one, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and peered through the windshield. "Are you sure this place still exists? That map looks like it's from the Clinton administration." "Trust me," Tom laughed, his boyish face breaking into that confident grin that had charmed countless clients. "My fraternity used to come up here every fall. It's completely off the grid. No cell towers, no park rangers, just pure wilderness, perfect for disconnecting from the corporate grind." Sarah leaned forward from the back seat, her long black hair falling over her shoulder. "Speaking of disconnecting, has anyone else noticed we lost cell service about 20 miles back?" I pulled out my phone and confirmed what we all already knew. No bars, no data, nothing. The modern world had simply evaporated somewhere between Cumberland and wherever we were now. "It's probably for the best," I said, though something cold twisted in my stomach. "We came here to get away from all that, right?" The road grew progressively narrower and more rutted as we climbed higher into the mountains. Dense stands of oak and maple pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a tunnel of gold and crimson that filtered the late afternoon sunlight into something almost otherworldly. The silence was profound. No traffic, no aircraft, not even the distant hum of civilization that you never really notice until it's gone. "There," Tom pointed ahead to a rusted metal sign barely visible through the undergrowth. "Savage River Trail. This is it." We parked at what could generously be called a trailhead, really just a widening in the road where someone had cleared away enough trees to fit a couple of vehicles. The silence that greeted us when Marcus turned off the engine was absolute, pressing against our eardrums like cotton. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned this place. Loading our packs took longer than expected. None of us were experienced backpackers, and we'd probably brought twice what we needed. City people overcompensating for our lack of wilderness knowledge. Tom had insisted on bringing a portable camp stove and enough food for a week, even though we were only staying 2 nights. Sarah had packed a first aid kit that could stock a small hospital. Marcus carried enough electronic gadgets to power a small city, though they'd be useless without cell service. "According to the map," Tom said, shouldering his pack with a grunt, "the campsite is about 3 miles up the trail, right where Savage River makes a bend around Bear Mountain. There's supposed to be a clearing with a natural fire ring." The trail began as a proper hiking path, marked with faded blazes and worn smooth by countless boots over the years. But within the first mile it became increasingly overgrown and difficult to follow. Branches caught at our clothes and scratched our faces. The forest floor was thick with decomposing leaves that released a rich, loamy smell with each step. Earthy and organic, but with an underlying hint of something less pleasant. Something that reminded me of the way meat smells when it's been left too long in the refrigerator. "Jesus, when was the last time anyone maintained this trail?" Sarah panted, stopping to untangle her hair from a low-hanging branch. Sweat darkened her blue hiking shirt despite the cool mountain air. Marcus checked his GPS unit for the dozenth time. "Still no signal. The satellite connection should work even without cell towers, but I'm getting nothing. It's like we've dropped off the face of the earth." Something about his words sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. I shook it off and pressed forward, determined not to let paranoia ruin our weekend getaway. The deeper we hiked into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches intertwining overhead to block out more and more of the sky. What little sunlight filtered through took on a greenish, underwater quality that made everything look slightly diseased. The silence was broken only by the sound of our breathing, our footsteps, and the occasional crack of a branch, though whether from our passage or something else, I couldn't tell. "Hold up," Tom called from the front of our little procession. He was studying his map with a frown. "This doesn't look right. According to this, we should have crossed a creek about half a mile back, but I haven't seen any water." "Maybe the creek dried up," I suggested, though my mouth felt increasingly dry. "It has been a relatively dry autumn." "Mountain streams don't just dry up," Marcus said, his voice tight with the kind of precision that made him such a good IT director. "They're fed by underground springs and snowmelt. If anything, they get stronger as you go higher into the mountains." Sarah was looking around nervously, her dark eyes darting between the trees. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Now that she'd said it, I realized I'd been fighting the same feeling for the last mile. A prickling sensation between my shoulder blades, the certainty that hidden eyes were tracking our every movement. I forced a laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. It's just the forest playing tricks on us. City people aren't used to this much nature. But even as I said it, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The trees around us were wrong somehow. Not in any way I could articulate, but wrong nonetheless. The bark looked almost scabbed in places, as if the trees were diseased. Many of the branches grew in impossible angles, twisting back on themselves in ways that defied biology. And the leaves, despite the season, weren't the brilliant colors we'd seen from the road. Here, they were mostly brown and black, curled at the edges as if burned. "Look," Tom said with forced cheerfulness. "There's the creek." Ahead, the trail descended toward a narrow stream that gurgled through a cut in the landscape. But the water was wrong too. Darker than it should be, with an oily sheen on the surface that reflected our faces in fractured, distorted ways. The smell rising from it wasn't the clean, mineral scent of mountain water, but something organic and fetal, like the inside of a mouth. "I wouldn't drink that without boiling it first," Marcus said, kneeling by the bank and dipping his fingers in the water. He pulled them back with a grimace. "It's warm. Mountain streams should be ice cold, even in October." Sarah had moved a few yards downstream, and her sharp intake of breath drew our attention. "Guys, you need to see this." We gathered around where she was pointing. Partially submerged in the dark water, caught against a fallen log, was something that might once have been an animal. The fur was matted and patchy, revealing skin that was an unhealthy grayish white. What remained of the face was elongated, the jaw unhinged and hanging at an impossible angle. The eyes were gone, leaving hollow sockets that seemed to stare at us with accusatory emptiness. "What the hell is that?" Tom whispered. Marcus, ever the analyst, moved closer for a better look. "Could be a deer that got caught in a flash flood. Decomposition in water can cause all kinds of distortion." But I'd seen enough nature documentaries to know that wasn't right. Whatever this thing had been, it was larger than any deer, closer to the size of a small horse, and those weren't hooves protruding from the swollen remains of its legs. They looked almost like hands, human hands with fingers elongated into claws. "We should keep moving," I said, fighting down the bile that rose in my throat. "The campsite can't be much farther." We crossed the stream by hopping from rock to rock, none of us wanting to step in that fetal water. The trail on the other side was even less defined, little more than a game path winding between massive oak trees whose trunks were scarred with deep gouges. The marks looked fresh, as if something with very large claws had recently sharpened them on the bark. The forest grew quieter as we climbed, not peaceful quiet, the heavy, oppressive silence of a held breath. Our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, echoing off the trees in ways that didn't make acoustic sense. Sometimes I thought I heard other footsteps, matching our pace but slightly out of sync, as if something was following us just out of sight. "There," Tom said finally, pointing ahead to where the trees thinned slightly. "That must be it." The clearing was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by towering trees that formed a perfect circle. In the center was indeed a ring of stones, blackened with soot from countless fires. But something about the arrangement bothered me. The stones weren't random rocks gathered from the surrounding area. They were all the same size, all perfectly oval, all polished smooth as if by centuries of handling. They looked less like a fire ring and more like something else. Something ceremonial. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah said, voicing what we were all thinking. "Are you sure this is the right spot, Tom?" Tom was studying his map again, his confident demeanor beginning to crack. "It has to be. The map shows a clearing right here, beside the river bend. But..." He looked around, confused. "Where's the river? We should be able to hear it from here." The silence pressed down on us like a physical weight. No river, no birds, no insects. Nothing but the sound of our own breathing and the rapid beating of our hearts. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," Marcus suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. We all knew we'd followed the only trail available, such as it was. "Let's just set up camp," I said, trying to inject some leadership into my voice. "We're all tired, and it'll be dark soon. In the morning, we can figure out where we went wrong." But as we began unpacking our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't gone wrong at all. We were exactly where we were supposed to be, where something had been leading us all along. Setting up the tents proved more difficult than expected. The ground was harder than it looked, forcing us to hammer the stakes through what felt like solid rock covered with a thin layer of soil. Marcus's expensive dome tent kept collapsing, as if the air pressure inside was wrong. Sarah's sleeping bag, when she unrolled it, released a smell like mothballs and decay that made us all step back. "Did you check this before we left?" I asked, covering my nose with my sleeve. "Of course I did," she snapped, then immediately looked apologetic. "Sorry, I'm just on edge, but I swear it smelled fine when I packed it." Tom was having his own problems with the camp stove. No matter what he tried, it wouldn't light. The gas was flowing, we could hear it hissing, but the igniter produced nothing but sparks that seemed to die before they could catch. "Forget the stove," I said. "Let's just build a fire in the ring. At least we know that works." But the fire proved just as problematic. We had plenty of dry wood from the fallen branches around the clearing, and Marcus had brought newspaper and lighter fluid. The kindling caught easily enough, but every time we tried to add larger pieces, the flames would sputter and die. After an hour of trying, we managed to coax a weak, smoky fire that threw more shadows than light. "This is ridiculous," Marcus muttered, adjusting his glasses. "Fire is basic chemistry. Fuel, oxygen, heat. It's not rocket science." "Maybe the wood is too green," Tom suggested half-heartedly. "Green wood doesn't crumble to ash in your hands," Sarah said, holding up her blackened fingers. Every piece we'd tried to add to the fire had simply disintegrated at our touch, leaving behind a fine gray powder that smelled like sulfur and old bones. By the time we gave up on the fire, full darkness had fallen. And what a darkness it was. Absolute and complete. pressing against our faces like black velvet. The weak flames barely illuminated our immediate circle, beyond which lay an impenetrable void. Our flashlights seemed strangely ineffective, their beams swallowed up by the darkness after only a few feet. We sat around the pathetic fire, sharing cold sandwiches and trying to make conversation, but our voices sounded thin and fragile in the enormous silence. Every small sound, the crack of settling wood, the rustle of leaves in a breeze we couldn't feel, made us all jump. "So," Sarah said, making an obvious effort to lighten the mood, "Jennifer, tell us about your new position. What's the first thing you're going to change?" I opened my mouth to answer, then froze. For a moment, I couldn't remember. Not just the details of my promotion, but my job entirely. Where did I work? What did I do? The memories were there, but distant and hazy, like trying to recall a dream after waking. The Hartwell account, I stammered, grasping for specifics that seemed to slip away like smoke. "We need to restructure the quarterly projections." Tom laughed, but it sounded forced. "Quarterly projections? Jesus, Jen, you really do need this vacation. Try to forget about work for 5 minutes." But that was just it. I was forgetting. Not just work, but everything. Details about my life that should have been as familiar as my own name felt foreign and uncertain. Had I always lived in the same apartment? Did I have a car? What about my family? Surely I had family somewhere, but their faces were indistinct, their names just out of reach. I looked at my companions and saw the same confusion in their eyes. Sarah was staring at her hands as if she'd never seen them before. Marcus had taken off his glasses and was cleaning them obsessively, though they looked perfectly clean to me. "Does anyone else feel weird?" Tom asked quietly. "Like, disconnected somehow?" "It's just the isolation," I said, though my voice shook. "Being cut off from civilization can play tricks on your mind." But I knew it was more than that. Something was fundamentally wrong with this place. Something that went beyond bad campfires and dying phones. The very air seemed thick and oppressive, each breath an effort, and underneath the surface I could sense something watching us, waiting for... What? We went to bed early, more to escape the oppressive darkness than from any real fatigue. I crawled into my sleeping bag fully clothed, clutching my flashlight like a talisman. Through the thin nylon of my tent, I could hear the others settling in for the night. The rustle of sleeping bags, muffled conversations, the zip of tent flaps closing. Then, gradually, silence. I lay on my back, staring up at the invisible ceiling of my tent, and tried to slow my racing heart. Every small sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The whisper of wind through branches, the distant call of what might have been an owl, the soft crackle of our dying fire. But then I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling our campsite. I held my breath and listened. The steps were too heavy to be human, but they moved with purpose and intelligence. Around and around our little circle of tents, never varying their pace, never stopping. Whatever was out there was taking its time, studying us, learning our patterns. I wanted to call out to the others, but something primitive and instinctual kept me silent. Some deep-buried survival instinct that knew the worst thing I could do was draw attention to myself. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent. I could hear breathing now. Slow, labored, wet-sounding breaths that seemed to come from something much larger than human lungs. The air inside my tent grew thick and humid, as if whatever was outside was exhaling directly through the fabric. Then I felt a pressure against the side of my tent, as if something was pressing its face against the nylon. The fabric stretched inward, and I could make out the vague outline of features. A nose, perhaps, or a muzzle. Too large to be human, too shaped to be animal. I bit my lip to keep from screaming, and slowly, carefully reached for my flashlight. If I could just shine it through the tent wall, maybe startle whatever was out there into leaving. My fingers found the flashlight switch and pressed it. Nothing happened. The light was dead, though it had been working perfectly just hours before. The pressure against my tent wall increased, and I heard a sound that will haunt me until the day I die. A low, rumbling vocalization that was part growl, part purr, and entirely alien. It seemed to vibrate through the ground and up into my bones, setting my teeth on edge and making my vision blur. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The pressure disappeared, the breathing faded, and the footsteps resumed their circuit around our camp. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag for what felt like hours, listening to those deliberate steps and fighting the urge to scream. Eventually, exhaustion overcame terror, and I fell into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of things with too many teeth and eyes like burning coals. I woke to Sarah's screams. The morning sun was filtering through my tent walls, and for a moment I felt a surge of relief. We'd survived the night. Then Sarah's shrieks cut through the peaceful morning air like broken glass, and I was scrambling out of my sleeping bag and tearing at my tent zipper. Sarah was standing in the center of our campsite, still in her pajamas, pointing at Tom's tent with a shaking finger. The tent was collapsed, the bright orange fabric stained with something dark that had soaked through from the inside. "He won't answer," she sobbed. "I tried to wake him up, but he won't answer." Marcus emerged from his own tent, his hair disheveled and his face pale. "What's wrong? What happened?" I approached Tom's tent on unsteady legs, already knowing what I was going to find, but hoping desperately that I was wrong. The zipper was pulled all the way down, the opening gaping like a wound. Inside, Tom's sleeping bag was empty, but it was unzipped from the inside. The dark stains on the fabric weren't mud. "Tom?" I called softly, though I knew there would be no answer. "Tom, where are you?" "His boots are still here," Marcus said, pointing to the hiking boots neatly arranged outside the tent entrance. "His pack, his clothes, everything's here except Tom himself. He was simply gone, vanished into the forest without a trace, leaving behind only his blood-stained sleeping bag and the growing certainty that whatever had been circling our camp last night had taken him. "We have to find him," Sarah said, wiping tears from her cheeks. "He could be hurt, lost. We can't just leave him." "We have to get out of here," I countered, my survival instincts finally overriding my shock. "Something's wrong with this place. We need to hike back to the car and get help." "Help from who?" Marcus demanded. "We're in the middle of nowhere with no cell service and no idea how to find our way back. That trail was barely visible in daylight, and you want to try to follow it back through miles of forest?" He was right, of course. In our panic to reach the campsite before dark, we'd paid little attention to landmarks or navigation. The twisted, overgrown trail had seemed difficult enough to follow in broad daylight. Retracing our steps would be nearly impossible. "Then we stay together," I said firmly. "Whatever happened to Tom, it won't happen to the rest of us if we stick together." But even as I said it, I could feel the wrongness of this place seeping into my bones. The forest around us looked different in the morning light. More diseased, more hostile. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches reaching toward us like gnarled fingers. The very air felt thick and oppressive, each breath an effort. We spent the morning searching for Tom, calling his name and following what might have been tracks in the soft earth around our campsite. But the prints, if that's what they were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Too large for human feet with claw marks that dug deep into the soil. "These can't be from Tom," Marcus said, kneeling beside one particularly clear impression. "Look at the size of them, and these gouges." "Bear tracks?" Sarah suggested hopefully. "Bears don't have opposable thumbs," I said, pointing to what was unmistakably a thumbprint beside the other claw marks. "And they don't arrange their kills in patterns." Because that's what we'd found as we expanded our search. A ring of dead animals arranged in a perfect circle about 50 yards from our campsite. Squirrels, rabbits, a raccoon, even a deer. All positioned with their heads pointing inward toward the center of the circle. All drained of blood, their eyes missing, their mouths locked open in silent screams. "This is some kind of ritual site," Marcus whispered, his face gray with horror. "We're not just lost. We're trespassing on something's territory." Something that took Tom. Sarah added unnecessarily. We returned to our campsite to find it changed. Our tents were still standing, our gear appeared untouched, but the stone fire ring had been altered. The smooth oval stones had been rearranged into a different pattern. No longer a circle, but a complex spiral that hurt to look at directly. And in the center, where our pathetic fire had struggled to burn the night before, was a pile of fresh bones. Human bones, by the look of them, though they were too clean and white to be recent. The skull that topped the pile grinned at us with empty sockets, its jaw hanging open as if frozen mid-scream. "We're leaving," I said, my voice steady despite the terror that was threatening to overwhelm me. "Right now. Pack only what you absolutely need." "Which way?" Marcus asked, looking around at the wall of trees that surrounded us. In all the panic, did anyone pay attention to which direction we came from? The horrible truth was that none of us had. The campsite was surrounded by forest on all sides, and in our fear and confusion, we'd lost all sense of direction. Every gap between the trees looked the same. Every shadow might hide a path or might lead deeper into the wilderness. "The stream," Sarah said suddenly. "We followed the stream to get here. If we can find it again, we can follow it back down the mountain." It was our only hope, and we seized on it desperately. We broke camp in record time, stuffing our packs with only the essentials and abandoning everything else. The stone spiral with its grisly centerpiece we left untouched. Some instinct warned us that disturbing it would be even worse than leaving it alone, but finding the stream proved impossible. We spent hours crashing through the underbrush, following what looked like trails but turned out to be animal paths that led nowhere. The forest seemed to shift around us, familiar landmarks disappearing and new obstacles appearing where none had been before. "This is impossible," Marcus panted, stopping to catch his breath against a massive oak tree. "We're going in circles. That rock outcropping, I swear we passed it an hour ago." He was right. Despite our best efforts to maintain a straight line, we kept coming back to the same places. The forest was playing with us, leading us deeper into its green maze with each turn. "Look at your compass," I told Marcus, remembering the expensive hiking equipment he'd brought. He pulled out the compass and stared at it in confusion. "It's spinning. The needle is just spinning. Like there's some kind of magnetic interference." That's when we heard it. Tom's voice, calling to us from somewhere in the trees ahead. "Help me," he called, his voice weak and distant. "I'm hurt. I can't move." Sarah started toward the sound immediately, but I grabbed her arm. "Wait," I hissed. "Something's not right." "He's hurt," she protested. "We have to help him." "Listen to his voice," I said. "Really listen." We all stood still, straining our ears. Tom's cries for help continued, but now that we were paying attention, the wrongness was obvious. The words were right, but the rhythm was off. Too measured, too perfect, like a recording being played on repeat. And underneath the human words, there was something else. A wet, clicking sound, like a tongue moving around too many teeth. "Help me," the voice called again, and this time we could tell it was moving, circling around us just out of sight. "I'm hurt. I can't move." "That's not Tom," Marcus whispered, his face white with terror. "Then what is it?" Sarah demanded. Before anyone could answer, the thing that was using Tom's voice stepped into view. It might have been human once, in the same way that a rotting log might once have been a tree. The basic shape was still there. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but everything was wrong. The limbs were too long, the joints bending in directions that human anatomy didn't allow. The skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over bones that seemed to have grown in impossible configurations. But it was the face that broke our minds. It was Tom's face, perfectly reproduced in every detail, but wearing an expression of such malevolent hunger that it transformed every familiar feature into something monstrous. The eyes were Tom's eyes, but they held no warmth, no humanity, only an ancient alien intelligence that was very, very hungry. "Help me," it said again in Tom's exact voice and smiled with Tom's mouth, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that belonged to no terrestrial creature. Sarah screamed. Marcus dropped his pack and ran. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing, my mind simply refusing to accept the impossibility before me. The thing that wore Tom's face tilted its head at an angle no human neck could achieve, and its smile widened until it split its face nearly in half. Then it moved, flowing toward us with liquid grace that defied physics. That broke my paralysis. I grabbed Sarah's hand and ran, crashing through the underbrush after Marcus, branches tearing at our clothes and faces. Behind us, we could hear the thing following, not running, but moving through the forest with the confidence of something that knew these woods intimately and understood that we had nowhere to go. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing beside a massive fallen tree trunk. Marcus was already there, his face streaked with tears and his breathing ragged. "What was that thing?" Sarah gasped between sobs. "What happened to Tom?" "Tom's dead," I said flatly, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. "That thing, it's wearing him, like a mask." "That's impossible," Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. We'd all seen the same thing, and denial wouldn't make it go away. A branch snapped somewhere behind us, and we all froze. In the distance, we could hear Tom's voice again, calling our names now, pleading with us to come back and help him. The thing was hunting us, using our friend's voice as bait. "We need to find shelter," I whispered. "Somewhere we can defend ourselves." "Defend ourselves with what?" Marcus demanded. "We don't have weapons. We don't even know what we're fighting." But Sarah was already moving, crawling along the fallen tree toward what looked like a hollow in its base. "Here," she hissed. "We can hide in here." The hollow was larger than it appeared from outside, carved out by decades of rot and insects. It was barely big enough for the three of us, and it smelled like decay and fungus, but it was shelter. We crawled inside and huddled together, trying to control our breathing while we listened for sounds of pursuit. "Help me," Tom's voice called from what sounded like just outside our hiding place. "I'm so cold, so hungry." None of us moved. We pressed closer together in the fetid darkness of our hollow and waited. The voice circled our hiding place for what felt like hours, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes making sounds that no human throat could produce. Once, something scratched at the entrance to our hollow. Long, deliberate gouges in the rotting wood that sent splinters raining down on our heads. But it didn't try to come in. Whatever the thing was, it seemed reluctant to enter our small sanctuary. Maybe the confined space limited its ability to move, or maybe there was something about the dead wood that it found distasteful. We didn't question our good fortune. We just pressed ourselves deeper into the hollow and prayed for dawn. When the scratching finally stopped and Tom's voice faded into the distance, we allowed ourselves to hope that it had given up and moved on. That was our first mistake. The second was falling asleep. I woke to the sound of Sarah screaming, but her screams were wrong, muffled and wet as if her mouth was full of blood. In the absolute darkness of our hollow, I couldn't see what was happening, but I could hear the struggle. The sound of bodies moving violently in the confined space, the wet, tearing noise of something being ripped apart. "Sarah!" I screamed, reaching out blindly in the darkness. My hands found something warm and wet that might once have been Sarah's arm, but the texture was all wrong. Too soft, too yielding, as if her bones had been removed and her flesh had become liquid. Whatever I was touching moved independently of any skeleton, writhing and pulsing with its own alien life. Marcus's screams joined Sarah's, but his voice was changing as I listened, becoming higher, more musical, until it didn't sound human at all. In the darkness, I could hear wet sounds, slithering sounds, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from inside my own skull. I scrambled toward the entrance of our hollow, desperate to escape whatever was happening to my friends, but something grabbed my ankle with fingers that were too long and had too many joints. I was dragged back into the darkness, my fingernails scraping futilely against the rotting wood. "Help me," Sarah's voice whispered in my ear, but it was speaking from the wrong direction. Not from where I'd last heard her, but from directly behind me. "I'm so cold, so hungry." I twisted around and found myself face to face with Sarah, but like Tom before her, everything was wrong. Her features were perfect replicas, but her eyes held that same alien intelligence, that same bottomless hunger. And when she smiled, her teeth were needle-sharp and far too numerous for any human mouth. "Help me," she repeated, and reached for me with arms that had grown additional joints and fingers that ended in curved talons. I screamed and thrashed, fighting against the impossible grip on my ankle, and somehow broke free. I crawled toward the entrance of the hollow on my hands and knees, expecting at any moment to be dragged back into that nightmare of transformed flesh and alien hunger. But I made it out. I burst from the hollow into the gray pre-dawn light and kept crawling, then stumbling, then running through the forest. Behind me I could hear voices calling my name, Tom's voice, Sarah's voice, and now Marcus's voice too, all pleading with me to come back and help them. I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. I ran through the forest like a madwoman, branches tearing at my clothes and face, until I could no longer hear the voices of my transformed friends. When I finally stopped, gasping and bleeding, I found myself in a different part of the forest entirely. The trees here were healthier, more natural, and I could hear the sound of running water somewhere nearby. Real water, not the fetal soup we'd found near our campsite. I followed the sound and found a proper mountain stream, clear, cold, and flowing downhill toward civilization. I didn't hesitate. I began following it, walking in the stream bed itself when the banks became too overgrown, letting the current guide me away from that cursed place. It took me 2 days to reach the road. 2 days of walking without rest, drinking stream water and eating nothing, jumping at every shadow and sound. By the time I stumbled onto the paved surface of Route 219, I was barely conscious, my feet raw and bleeding, my clothes torn to shreds. A passing motorist found me and called for help. I spent 3 days in the hospital in Oakland, Maryland, being treated for exposure, dehydration, and what the doctors politely called psychological trauma. The police came to take my statement, but what could I tell them? That my friends had been transformed into monsters by some ancient evil lurking in the Savage River wilderness, that the forest itself was somehow alive and malevolent. I told them we'd gotten lost, that my friends had wandered off in the night and I'd been unable to find them. Search and rescue teams combed the area for weeks, but they found nothing. No trace of Tom, Sarah, or Marcus. No sign of our campsite. Not even the trail we'd followed into the forest. "Are you sure about the location?" the search coordinator asked me. "We've mapped every trail in Savage River State Forest, and there's no campsite matching your description." I showed them Tom's hand-drawn map, but the paper had somehow become blank. Just an old, yellowed piece of paper with no markings at all. My photos from the trip were similarly empty, showing nothing but static or completely black frames. It was as if the entire experience had been erased from reality, leaving me as the only witness to what had happened in those cursed woods. The official report listed my 3 friends as missing, presumed dead in a hiking accident. Their families held memorial services. The company sent flowers and offered counseling services. Life moved on, as it always does, leaving behind only questions that would never be answered and nightmares that would never fade. But I knew the truth. Whatever ancient evil lurked in the depths of Savage River State Forest was still out there, still hungry, still wearing the faces of my friends like masks. Sometimes late at night I would get phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize. When I answered, I would hear familiar voices. Tom's laugh, Sarah's worried tone, Marcus's precise way of speaking, asking me to come back, telling me they missed me, insisting they needed my help. I changed my phone number 3 times before I stopped answering calls altogether. The nightmares were worse. Every night I would dream of that hollow in the fallen tree, of reaching out in the darkness and touching something that had once been Sarah but was now something else entirely. I would dream of running through endless forests while voices that I loved called my name from the shadows, growing less human with each repetition. I moved away from Maryland, thinking that distance might help, but geography means nothing to the kind of evil I encountered in those woods. No matter where I went, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, I would sometimes catch glimpses of familiar faces in crowds. Tom browsing magazines in a bookstore, his movements too fluid and his smile too wide. Sarah waiting at a bus stop, her eyes tracking my movement with predatory intensity. Marcus standing motionless in the rain, water streaming down his face like tears, his mouth moving in words I was grateful I couldn't hear. They were hunting me, I realized, following me, waiting for the right moment to complete whatever transformation they had begun in that rotten hollow. The thing that had taken my friends wasn't finished with me yet. 6 months after the incident, I made a decision that probably saved my life, though it cost me everything else. I liquidated my assets, withdrew my savings, and disappeared into the anonymity of America's homeless population. I became invisible, just another street person that regular citizens looked through rather than at. For 2 years, I lived this way, moving from city to city, sleeping in shelters and under bridges, always watching for faces that were too familiar and smiles that were too wide. The constant fear and paranoia took their toll. I lost weight, developed a nervous twitch, and started talking to myself in ways that made even other homeless people avoid me. But I was alive. Whatever had been hunting me seemed to have lost my trail. That's when I made my second mistake. I got complacent. I had settled temporarily in a homeless camp outside of Atlanta. The other residents were the usual mix of addicts, mentally ill, and people who'd simply run out of options. I kept to myself, sharing my real name with no one, but for the first time in 2 years, I began to relax slightly. The camp was built around an abandoned factory, and most of us slept in the ruins of the old buildings. There was a kind of community there. People looked out for each other, shared resources, and generally tried to maintain some semblance of human dignity despite our circumstances. It was Marcus who told me about the new arrivals. Not the Marcus I'd known. This was a different Marcus, a grizzled veteran named Marcus Williams who'd been living rough for the better part of a decade. But when he told me about the 3 new people who'd joined our little community, something cold settled in my stomach. "Strange folks," he said, sharing a can of beans heated over our small fire. "Real polite, but something off about them. They asked about you specifically, said they were looking for an old friend named Jennifer." I was packed and gone within the hour, but it was already too late. As I made my way through the darkened factory ruins toward the highway, I heard them calling to me. "Jennifer," Tom's voice echoed through the empty buildings. "We've missed you so much." "Don't run," Sarah's voice added from a different direction. "We just want to talk. We have so much to tell you." Marcus's familiar, precise tone came from directly behind me. "About what we've learned. About what we've become." I ran through the maze of abandoned machinery and collapsed walls, my footsteps echoing off concrete and steel. But no matter which way I turned, the voices followed, sometimes calling from ahead of me, sometimes from behind, sometimes from directly above as if they were crawling across the ceiling like spiders. The factory was larger than I'd realized, and in my panic I quickly became lost in its industrial labyrinth. The voices of my friends grew closer, more intimate, speaking directly into my ears as if they were walking beside me. "Remember that night in the hollow?" Sarah's voice whispered. "How close we were. How we became one." "You left us," Tom's voice accused. "You abandoned us when we needed you most." "But we forgive you," Marcus added. "We understand why you were frightened. The transformation can be overwhelming." I stumbled into what had once been the factory's main assembly floor, a vast space filled with rusted conveyor belts and hanging chains. Moonlight streamed through broken skylights, casting everything in silver and shadow. And there, standing on the far side of the room, were my friends. They looked exactly as they had that last morning at our campsite. Healthy, familiar, completely human. For a moment, my heart leaped with desperate hope. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe they'd escaped somehow, survived whatever had happened in that cursed forest. Then Tom smiled and his mouth kept opening, wider and wider, until his face split in half and something with too many teeth emerged from the ruin of his skull. I screamed and ran, but they were faster now, no longer bothering to maintain their human facades. I caught glimpses of them in my peripheral vision as I fled. Sarah flowing along the walls like liquid shadow, Marcus skittering across the ceiling on limbs that had multiplied and twisted into impossible configurations, Tom pursuing me with his face hanging open like a broken door. I burst through an exit into the night air, gasping and sobbing, and found myself face to face with a police car. 2 officers were getting out, their hands moving toward their weapons as they took in my wild appearance and obvious distress. "Ma'am," one of them called, "are you all right? We got reports of screaming." I looked back at the factory, expecting to see my transformed friends emerging in pursuit, but there was nothing, just empty darkness and the sound of wind through broken windows. I'm fine, I managed. Just lost. The officers exchanged glances. "Ma'am, you're bleeding, and you look like you've been living rough. How about we get you to a hospital, get you checked out?" I almost refused. Hospitals meant paperwork, records, a trail that could be followed. But I was exhausted, bleeding from dozens of cuts, and for the first time in 2 years, I was in the presence of normal people who couldn't possibly be wearing my friends' faces. "Okay," I whispered. "Yes, please." The hospital stay lasted a week. The doctors treated my physical injuries and gently suggested psychiatric evaluation, which I declined. But the rest, the safety of locked doors and security guards, gave me time to think and plan. I couldn't keep running forever. Whatever had taken my friends was patient and relentless, and it would never stop hunting me. But maybe I didn't have to run. Maybe I could turn the hunt around. I knew where it had all started. Savage River State Forest. That cursed clearing where we'd made our camp. If there was a way to end this nightmare, it would be there, at the source. I spent the next 6 months preparing. I researched everything I could find about the history of the area, poring over old newspapers and local folklore in libraries across the region. What I found painted a picture of a place that had been wrong long before we'd stumbled into it. Native American tribes had avoided the area for centuries, calling it the place where spirits hunger. Early settlers had reported strange disappearances and unexplained phenomena. In 1847, an entire wagon train had vanished somewhere in those woods, leaving behind only scattered bones arranged in spiral patterns. In 1923, a logging camp had been found abandoned, the workers gone without a trace but their tools arranged in ritualistic circles. The pattern was always the same. People would go into those woods and disappear, only to be seen later by friends and family, acting slightly wrong, speaking in voices that were almost but not quite right. The returned ones would lure others into the forest, expanding whatever ancient hunger dwelled in that place. I also prepared physically, learning to use weapons, studying survival techniques, and getting myself into the best shape of my life. If I was going back to that place, I would go armed and ready. The hardest part was the waiting. For 6 months, I saw no sign of my transformed friends. No familiar faces in crowds, no phone calls in the night, no whispered voices calling my name. Either they had truly lost my trail, or they were waiting for something. I suspected the latter. When I finally returned to Western Maryland, it was late October again, almost exactly 3 years after our original camping trip. The autumn colors were just as spectacular as I remembered, painting the mountains in shades of fire and blood. I parked at the same spot where Marcus had left his SUV, now marked by a small memorial plaque that someone had placed there, probably the families of my missing friends. The sight of it nearly broke my resolve, but I forced myself to continue. The trail was exactly as I remembered. Overgrown, hard to follow, leading into a forest that felt increasingly wrong with every step. But this time, I was ready. I carried a GPS unit, a satellite phone, and enough weapons to fight a small war. More importantly, I carried knowledge. The creature, or creatures, that had taken my friends were ancient, but they followed patterns. They were bound to their territory, unable to venture too far from their source of power. And that source was the clearing where we'd camped, where those smooth stones formed their ritual circle. It took me most of the day to find the clearing again. The forest seemed to shift around me just as it had before, leading me in circles and down false trails. But I was prepared for that too, marking my path with reflective tape and following my GPS coordinates with religious precision. When I finally stepped into that cursed clearing, I felt the familiar weight of wrongness settle over me like a shroud. The stone circle was still there, still arranged in that spiral pattern that hurt to look at directly. But now there were more bones at the center, not just the ancient skull we'd found, but fresh remains that looked disturbingly familiar. I recognized Tom's watch on one skeletal wrist. Sarah's distinctive earrings lay scattered among the vertebrae. Marcus's glasses sat perched on an empty skull, their lenses reflecting the dying light. But these weren't the real remains of my friends. These were props, a stage dressing meant to unsettle me. The real Tom, Sarah, and Marcus, or what they had become, were still out there, and they knew I was here. "Hello, Jennifer," Tom's voice called from the tree line. "We've been waiting for you." They emerged from the forest as I'd seen them that last time in the factory, wearing their human faces like masks, their movements just slightly wrong, their smiles too wide and too knowing. "You came back," Sarah said, and there was something like genuine pleasure in her voice. "We knew you would. We've been so lonely without you." "Lonely and hungry," Marcus added, his precise diction unchanged despite everything else that had been altered. "But now you're here, and we can finally complete what we started." I pulled the shotgun from my pack and chambered around. The sound echoed through the clearing like thunder. "Stay back," I warned. "I know what you are now. I know how to stop you." They laughed in perfect harmony, a sound no human throats could have produced. "You can't kill us, Jennifer," Tom said. "We're not alive, not in any way you'd understand. We're something much more now." "Then let's find out," I said, and fired. The shotgun blast took Tom center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. But he was back on his feet almost immediately, his chest a ruin of torn flesh and splintered bone, yet still moving, still smiling with that too wide mouth. "Did that make you feel better?" he asked conversationally. "We don't feel pain anymore, Jennifer. We don't feel anything except the hunger." I fired again and again, putting round after round into the things that wore my friends' faces. They staggered with each impact, their human facades cracking to reveal the alien anatomy beneath, but they kept coming. When the shotgun clicked empty, I dropped it and pulled out the flare gun I'd brought as backup. Military grade, designed to burn at over 3,000 degrees. If these things had any vulnerability, it would be fire. The flare took Sarah full in the face, and for the first time, she screamed. A sound that started human but quickly became something else entirely. Her features melted and ran like wax, revealing something underneath that my mind simply refused to process. The other two recoiled from the burning flare, their borrowed faces showing the first genuine emotion I'd seen: fear. "Iron and fire," I said, understanding flooding through me. The old protections still work. I had more flares, and I used them all, driving the creatures back toward the stone circle at the center of the clearing. They were wounded now. Their human disguises burned away to reveal the writhing, impossible forms beneath. But they were also becoming more desperate, more dangerous. "You don't understand," The thing that had been Marcus hissed through a mouth that was no longer in the right place on its face. "We're trying to help you, to make you like us, immortal, beyond human weakness." "We were friends," the Sarah thing added, its voice now coming from somewhere in its chest rather than its ruined mouth. "We loved you. We still do." "Then let me help you," I said, pulling out my final weapon, a military thermite grenade I'd acquired through channels I preferred not to think about. "Let me end your suffering." I pulled the pin and tossed the grenade into the center of the stone circle, among the bones and artifacts of whatever ancient power ruled this place. The creatures shrieked and tried to reach it, but the iron in my blood and the holy water I'd blessed it with formed a barrier they couldn't cross. The thermite detonated with a brilliant white flash, burning at temperatures hot enough to melt steel. The stone circle exploded, sending fragments flying in all directions. The ancient bones crumbled to ash, and the creatures that had worn my friends' faces simply unraveled. I watched them dissolve back into the elements that had shaped them, their alien forms breaking apart into wisps of shadow and malevolent light. For just a moment, I thought I saw my real friends, Tom, Sarah, and Marcus as they had been in life, standing at the edge of the clearing. They looked peaceful, grateful, finally free. Then they were gone, and I was alone in a forest that suddenly felt normal again. The oppressive weight that had hung over this place for so long had lifted. Birds were singing in the trees. The air smelled clean and fresh, not of decay and ancient hunger. I stumbled out of the forest as the sun was setting, my body battered and my mind reeling from what I'd witnessed. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt truly safe. The hunt was over. My friends were at peace, and the ancient evil that had claimed so many victims over the centuries was finally destroyed. The drive back to civilization passed in a blur of exhaustion and relief. I checked into a motel in Cumberland and slept for 18 hours straight, the first truly restful sleep I'd had since that terrible night in the forest. When I woke, I found messages on my satellite phone from the families of my missing friends. Somehow, they'd all had the same dream the night before. Tom, Sarah, and Marcus appearing to them one last time to say goodbye, to tell them they were finally at peace and to thank them for never giving up hope. The official case was never closed, but it was quietly filed away. 3 friends lost in a hiking accident, their bodies never recovered. It happens more often than people realize in America's vast wilderness areas. I returned to something resembling a normal life, though I never went camping again. I found work, rented an apartment, and tried to rebuild the connections that 3 years of running and hiding had severed. But some experiences leave marks that never fully heal. I still have nightmares sometimes, though they're different now. Instead of being hunted through endless forests by things wearing familiar faces, I dream of that moment when I saw my real friends one last time. Peaceful, grateful, free. In my dreams, we're back at that campsite before everything went wrong, sitting around a proper fire, sharing stories and laughter under a sky full of stars. And sometimes, when I wake from those dreams, I can almost convince myself that's how it really ended. That we're all still there, safe and happy, and that the horror that followed was just a nightmare born of too much stress and too little sleep. But then, I see the scars on my hands from that final confrontation, feel the ache in my bones from 3 years of running and hiding, and I remember the truth. Evil exists in the world. Ancient, patient, hungry evil that wears familiar faces and speaks in voices we love. But it can be fought. It can be defeated. And sometimes, if we're very brave and very lucky, we can save the people we care about, even if we can't save them the way we'd hoped. The clearing in Savage River State Forest remains empty now, the stone circle destroyed, the ancient hunger finally sated by its own destruction. But I know there are other places like it, other hungry shadows waiting in the deep woods of America, and other groups of friends who might stumble into them unprepared. That's why I'm telling this story. Not because I want sympathy or understanding, but because I want people to know that there are things in the wilderness that shouldn't be there, and that not every trail leads to scenic views and peaceful campsites. Some trails lead to places where spirits hunger, where ancient evils wait with infinite patience for the next group of unprepared visitors to stumble into their domain. And if you're unlucky enough to find one of those places, remember what I learned. Iron and fire, holy water and blessed ground, and above all, the kind of love that's willing to face impossible odds to free the souls of the people you care about. My friends are at peace now. That's worth everything I went through to achieve it. And someday, when my own time comes, I know they'll be waiting for me. Not as the twisted things they became, but as themselves, whole and human and free. But until then, I have work to do. There are other stories like mine, other people who've encountered things that shouldn't exist and lived to tell about it. I collect these stories now, document them, and try to prepare others for the realities that exist just beyond the edge of our safe, civilized world. Because evil is patient, and it's always hungry, and it's always looking for the next group of friends planning an innocent camping trip to the wilderness. Don't let it be you. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Savage Mountain, deep in the Savage River State Forest of western Maryland, where the ancient Appalachian ridges hold secrets that should never be disturbed. I should have listened to the warnings about that place. The locals in nearby Grantsville spoke in hushed tones about the mountain, how hikers went missing there, how even the wildlife avoided certain hollows. But I was stubborn, determined to prove that I could handle myself in the wilderness after my divorce from Derek. I needed to reclaim my independence, to show myself I wasn't the fragile woman he'd convinced me I was during our 5 years of marriage. My hiking partner was supposed to be my friend Marcus, but he'd backed out at the last minute. Something about a bad feeling, he'd said. Instead, I found myself paired with two strangers through an online hiking forum. Thomas Davis, a 34-year-old insurance adjuster from Baltimore, and his girlfriend, Chloe Sanders, a 26-year-old veterinary student. They seemed nice enough when we met at the trailhead parking area near the Big Run Road, though Thomas had an intensity about him that made me slightly uncomfortable. He kept checking his expensive GPS device and muttering about getting off the beaten path. Chloe was quieter, almost timid, with nervous energy that manifested in constant fidgeting with her gear. She'd mentioned this was only her third backpacking trip, and I could tell she was trying hard to impress Thomas. The dynamic between them felt strained, like they were performing happiness rather than living it. We started our trek on the afternoon of October 13th, planning a 3-day loop through the most remote sections of the forest. The trail began innocuously enough, winding through dense hardwood forest where the autumn leaves created a canopy of fire above us. The sound of our boots crunching through fallen leaves was oddly muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing the noise. By evening, we'd reached our planned campsite near Big Run, a remote creek that carved its way through a narrow valley. The water ran black and silent, reflecting the darkening sky like obsidian. As we set up camp, I noticed something strange. The normal forest sounds were absent. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Weird how quiet it is, I mentioned to Thomas as he wrestled with his tent stakes. He looked up, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. Probably just the season. Animals are bedding down for winter. But I'd camped in Maryland forests before, and this felt wrong. Even in late fall, there should have been something. The distant hoot of an owl, the scurry of a chipmunk, the splash of a beaver in the creek. Instead, there was only the whisper of wind through bare branches, and even that sounded somehow unnatural, like voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding. Chloe emerged from her tent, her face pale in the gathering dusk. I can't get comfortable in there. It feels like something's watching me. Thomas laughed, but it sounded forced. It's just the woods. Babe, you're not used to sleeping outdoors yet. As darkness fell, we gathered around our small campfire. I'd brought a lightweight camping stove, but Thomas had insisted on building a fire the traditional way. It had taken him nearly an hour to get it started, and even now the flames seemed reluctant, guttering and changing color from normal orange to an unsettling blue-green that made our faces look corpse-like. We shared a dinner of freeze-dried meals and granola bars, but the food tasted wrong, metallic, like it had been sitting too long in a can. The water from our purification tablets had a sulfurous odor that made my stomach turn. Even the familiar ritual of camp cooking felt off, as if we were going through the motions of something that had lost all meaning. "So, what brought you out here, Jennifer?" Thomas asked, his eyes reflecting the strange firelight in a way that made them seem to glow. I told them about my divorce, about needing to prove something to myself. The words came out wrong, too personal, as if the darkness was pulling confessions from me. Chloe shared her own story, how she'd been struggling with veterinary school, how Thomas was the only good thing in her life right now. Her voice cracked when she spoke, and I saw tears glistening on her cheeks. Thomas remained mostly silent, just watching us with that intense stare. When pressed, he only said he'd needed to get away from the city, that his job was consuming him from the inside. The way he said it, with such venom, made me wonder what he really did for work. That first night, I barely slept. The silence was so complete, it felt like being buried alive. When I did drift off, I was plagued by dreams of something moving through the forest, something that walked on two legs but wasn't quite human. In my dreams, I could hear it whispering my name, drawing closer to our small camp with each repetition. I woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of my tent zipper being slowly pulled open. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lay perfectly still, listening. The zipper stopped halfway, and through the gap I could see nothing but impenetrable darkness. No moonlight, no stars, just void. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The zipper closed with a sharp whisper, and I heard footsteps moving away from my tent. Soft, deliberate steps that didn't quite match the rhythm of human walking. I lay there until dawn, clutching my camping knife, too terrified to investigate. The next morning, I found Thomas already awake, staring into the cold ashes of our fire. His face was gaunt, shadowed with exhaustion. "Rough night?" I asked. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes. "Did you hear it? The whispering?" A chill ran down my spine. What whispering? All night, voices in the trees, calling our names, Chloe's name especially. He glanced toward her tent, which remained zipped shut. She didn't hear it. She never hears things like that. I wanted to tell him about my tent zipper, but something held me back. Instead, I busied myself with breaking camp, eager to move on from this place. When Chloe finally emerged, she looked worse than both of us, pale and shaky, with dark circles under her eyes. "I had the strangest dreams," she said, accepting a cup of instant coffee with trembling hands. "I dreamed I was walking through the forest, but I wasn't me. I was someone else, someone who'd been dead for a long time. And there were others with me, all walking toward something we couldn't see but knew we had to reach." Thomas grabbed her hand, squeezing too hard. "It's just the altitude, and being in a new environment. Your brain's processing the stress." But his explanation felt hollow. We were only at about 2,000 feet elevation, hardly enough to cause problems. And Chloe's description matched elements of my own dreams too closely for comfort. We broke camp in uncomfortable silence and began the day's hike deeper into the forest. Our planned route would take us along the ridge of Savage Mountain, through terrain that hadn't been maintained in years. The trail markers became increasingly sparse, and by midday we were navigating primarily by Thomas's GPS device. That's when the first truly disturbing thing happened. Thomas stopped abruptly, staring at his GPS with a frown. "That's impossible," he muttered. "What?" I asked, moving closer to look at the screen. The device showed our location as a small dot in the middle of what appeared to be a lake. According to the GPS, we were underwater, hundreds of feet below the surface of a body of water that didn't exist. "Must be a satellite error," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. He powered the device off and on, but the reading remained the same. We were standing on solid ground, surrounded by forest, but according to our GPS, we were drowning. Chloe pulled out her smartphone, but it showed no signal bars and a battery that had mysteriously drained from 80% to 12% overnight. My own phone was completely dead, despite being fully charged when we'd left the trailhead. "Let's just keep following the ridgeline," I suggested, fighting to keep the panic out of my voice. "We'll hit the loop trail eventually." But as we continued hiking, the landscape began to feel increasingly wrong. The trees seemed too tall, their branches reaching toward a sky that looked somehow too distant. The forest floor was carpeted with leaves that rustled with each step, but the sound was delayed, as if it took time for our footfalls to register in this place. Most disturbing were the trees themselves. As we walked, I began to notice patterns in the bark, whorls and ridges that looked almost like faces, expressions of agony frozen in wood and sap. When I pointed this out to the others, they saw it too, and we found ourselves unconsciously quickening our pace. The trail, if it could still be called that, began to descend into a narrow hollow. The canopy closed overhead, blocking out most of the weak autumn sun. The air grew noticeably colder, and our breath began to mist. The silence was so complete that our own heartbeats seemed loud. That's when we found the first sign. It was nailed to a massive oak tree. The wood gray and weathered, but the message still clear: "Turn back. The mountain remembers." Below it, carved into the bark, were dozens of initials and dates stretching back decades. The most recent was from just 2 years ago: MR plus SP 10 and 15 to 23. Below that, someone had scratched, "They took her." Chloe made a small sound of distress. "Maybe we should head back. This doesn't feel right." Thomas studied the sign with an expression I couldn't read. Local nonsense. Probably trying to keep hikers away from their private hunting grounds. But I noticed his hand was shaking as he pulled out his map. The paper itself looked wrong. The contour lines seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, and the printed trail we were following appeared to dead end into blank space. "Thomas," I said carefully, "when you planned this route, did you notice anything unusual about the topographical maps?" He looked up from the map, and for a moment his face was completely blank, as if he'd forgotten who I was. Then awareness returned to his eyes, but it was different somehow. Colder. "Everything's fine, Jennifer. We stick to the plan." The way he said my name sent ice through my veins. It was the same tone I'd heard in my dreams, the whisper that had called to me through the darkness. We continued deeper into the hollow, and the changes became more pronounced. The trees grew in impossible configurations. Branches that twisted back on themselves, roots that climbed up trunks instead of diving into earth. The very air seemed thicker, harder to breathe, as if we were descending not just in elevation but in some other dimension entirely. It was Chloe who first noticed we were being followed. "There's something behind us," she whispered, grabbing my arm with fingers that felt like ice. "I can hear it walking when we stop." I listened, holding my breath. At first, there was only the oppressive silence. Then, faintly, I heard it. The soft pad of footsteps, always stopping just a moment after we did. When we resumed walking, the footsteps resumed too, maintaining a constant distance. Thomas seemed oblivious, walking ahead with mechanical determination. When I called to him about the sounds, he turned back with that same blank expression, as if he was having trouble focusing on our words. "Just echoes," he said, but his voice sounded hollow, distant. Sound carries strangely in places like this. But I knew it wasn't echoes. The footsteps had a different rhythm, a subtle wrongness that suggested something that walked upright but wasn't quite human. and they were getting closer. As afternoon wore on, the sky visible through the canopy began to darken prematurely. The temperature dropped further, and frost began to form on the trees despite the fact that it was still early fall. Our breath came in visible puffs, and I realized with growing alarm that we might not make it to our planned campsite before nightfall. "We need to find shelter," I said, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the forest before it could reach the others. I had to repeat myself louder before Chloe heard me. We found a small clearing beside what might once have been a stream, though it was dry now, filled only with smooth stones that looked like bones in the fading light. As we began to set up camp, I noticed that my supplies had changed. The granola bars in my pack had turned to mush, as if they'd been sitting in water for weeks. My sleeping bag smelled of mildew and decay despite being brand new. Most disturbing was the discovery that our water supply had turned brackish overnight, despite being purified just that morning. The liquid was thick and oily, with a taste that made my stomach revolt. We had no choice but to drink it. Dehydration would kill us faster than whatever was contaminating our water. Thomas built another fire, but this one fought him even more than the night before. The flames kept going out, as if something was blowing them from within. When they did catch, they burned that same sickly blue-green color, casting everything in a corpse light that made our skin look translucent. That's when we heard the first scream. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, a sound that didn't belong to any animal I could identify. High-pitched and wavering, it held a note of agony that made every hair on my body stand on end. The scream went on for nearly 30 seconds before cutting off abruptly, leaving a silence that felt like a held breath. Chloe was crying now, quiet tears that froze on her cheeks before they could fall. "I want to go home," she whispered. "Please, can we just go home?" I wanted to comfort her, but I was fighting my own rising panic. The rational part of my mind knew we were in serious trouble. Lost, with contaminated supplies, in terrain that didn't match our maps. But the irrational part, the part that had been growing stronger since we'd entered this place, whispered that our problems were much worse than being lost. Thomas sat motionless beside the fire, staring into the flames with an expression of terrible concentration. When I spoke to him, he didn't respond. When I touched his shoulder, he felt cold as stone. "Thomas?" I shook him harder. "Thomas, we need to talk about getting out of here." He turned to look at me, and I almost screamed. His eyes were completely black, pupils dilated so wide they consumed the iris. When he smiled, I saw that his teeth had become sharp, pointed like an animal's. "We can't leave," he said in a voice that was his but somehow not his. "The mountain won't let us." I grabbed Chloe's hand and pulled her away from the fire, away from the thing that had been Thomas. She was shaking so hard I could hear her teeth chattering. "We have to run," I whispered urgently. "Something's wrong with him." But as we backed away from the firelight, I realized we were surrounded. Dark shapes moved between the trees, human in silhouette but wrong in proportion, too tall and thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. They didn't make any sound as they moved, but I could feel their attention focused on us like cold fingers probing my thoughts. The thing that had been Thomas stood up slowly, joints popping like dry twigs. "You can't run from what you are," it said in that terrible voice. "The mountain knows you. It's known you since you were born. It's been calling you here your whole life, Jennifer. Every bad decision, every moment of pain, it all led you to this place." The words hit me like physical blows because they felt true. My failed marriage, my desperate need to prove myself, the online forum where I'd found these strangers, it all felt scripted now, inevitable, as if I'd never had any real choice in coming here. The dark shapes began to close in, and I could see them more clearly in the firelight. They had once been human, I realized with horror. The faces were recognizable as people, but stretched and distorted, as if someone had tried to reshape clay while it was still warm. Their mouths hung open in permanent screams, and their eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. One of them stepped fully into the light, and I saw the initials carved into its forehead. M.R., the missing hiker from the sign. She had been transformed into something else, something that belonged to the mountain now. Chloe made a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream. I looked at her and saw that she was changing too. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and her fingers were stretching, becoming too long, the joints multiplying. She looked at me with eyes that still held awareness, still held terror at what was happening to her. "Help me," she whispered, and I could see her fighting against the transformation, her body trembling with the effort. "I don't want to become like them." But I could feel it starting in myself too, a coldness spreading through my limbs, a detachment from my own body as if I was watching someone else's life from a great distance. The mountain was claiming us, making us part of whatever ancient hunger dwelt in this place. In that moment of horror, something inside me rebelled. Maybe it was the same stubbornness that had brought me here, or maybe it was simple human refusal to surrender. I grabbed the knife from my belt and lunged at the Thomas thing, driving the blade deep into what had been its chest. It looked down at the knife with mild interest, black blood oozing around the blade. "That won't work," it said conversationally. "I'm not Thomas anymore. Thomas is gone. The mountain ate him while he slept, and now it wears his shape." But the attack had given me a moment of clarity. While the thing was distracted, I grabbed Chloe's hand and ran into the darkness beyond the firelight. Behind us, I heard the Thomas thing laugh, a sound like wind through a graveyard. We crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and skin. Chloe's transformation seemed to pause in the face of immediate danger, and she ran beside me with desperate human strength. Behind us, the dark shapes gave chase, moving through the forest with inhuman grace. I had no plan except to get away from the camp, to put distance between us and whatever was happening there. But as we ran, I began to realize that the forest itself was working against us. Branches caught at our clothes like grasping fingers. Roots rose up to trip us. The ground seemed to shift beneath our feet, leading us in circles despite our best efforts to maintain a straight line. Most terrifying was the growing certainty that we weren't alone in our flight. The dark shapes weren't just behind us. They were ahead of us too, herding us like sheep toward some predetermined destination. I could see them in my peripheral vision, keeping pace through the trees, waiting for us to exhaust ourselves. We stumbled into another clearing, and I felt my heart sink. It was the same clearing where we'd camped, the same ring of stones, the same dying fire. We had been running in a circle, and the thing wearing Thomas's face was waiting for us with that terrible smile. "The mountain doesn't like to be refused," it said. "You'll find it much easier if you just accept what's happening." Chloe collapsed beside me, her transformation accelerating now. Her spine was stretching, making her taller and thinner. Her fingers had become long talons that scraped against the ground, but her eyes still held human intelligence, and I saw the plea in them. End this before it finished. I looked at the knife in my hand, then at Chloe's tortured face. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but I knew what I had to do. I couldn't save her from what was happening, but I could save her from becoming one of those things. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and I used the knife. Chloe's body went still, and the transformation stopped. For a moment, she looked human again, peaceful. Then the mountain's anger hit me like a physical force, knocking me to my knees. The Thomas thing snarled, its pleasant mask finally slipping. "You've cost us a servant. The mountain will take that out of your flesh." The dark shapes closed in from all sides, and I knew I had only moments. In desperation, I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it at the nearest creature. It recoiled with a shriek, and I realized they were afraid of the flame. I grabbed more burning wood, creating a circle of fire around myself. The creatures stopped their advance, but I knew it was only temporary. The flames were already dying, and I could see hunger in their reflective eyes. That's when I noticed the stream bed, the one that had been dry when we'd arrived. Water was flowing through it now, black water that steamed in the cold air. And I remembered something from my childhood, my grandmother's stories about running water, how evil things couldn't cross it. Without hesitation, I broke from my circle of fire and dove into the stream. The water was shockingly cold, so cold it felt like liquid nitrogen against my skin. But as I submerged myself, I felt the mountain's grip on me loosen. The coldness that had been spreading through my body began to recede. I surfaced, gasping, and the creatures on the bank hissed and backed away. They couldn't follow me into the water. I had found sanctuary, at least temporarily. But sanctuary wasn't escape. I was trapped in the stream, unable to return to shore without facing the creatures, unable to move up or downstream without losing the protection of this particular stretch of water. The cold was already numbing my limbs, and I knew I couldn't survive long in these temperatures. That's when I heard the sound. A distant rumble, like thunder, but constant. Looking downstream, I saw lights moving through the forest. Flashlights, and behind them, the sound of vehicles. The rescue team had finally found us. The creatures melted back into the forest as the searchers approached, and I dragged myself from the stream onto the muddy bank. Hypothermia was setting in, making my movements clumsy and my thoughts slow, but I managed to call out before losing consciousness. I woke up in a hospital in Cumberland, Maryland, 3 days later. The doctors said I'd been found suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration, delirious, and talking about creatures in the forest. They found no trace of Thomas or Chloe despite extensive searches. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead, victims of the wilderness. But I knew better. I knew what had happened to them, what had almost happened to me. The doctors and psychiatrists wanted to explain it all away. Stress, exhaustion, hallucinations brought on by dehydration and exposure. They said I'd created an elaborate fantasy to cope with the trauma of my companions' deaths. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was all in my head, a complete psychotic break brought on by being lost in the woods. But then, why won't my wounds heal properly? The scratches on my arms and face refused to close, remaining raw and infected despite treatment. And why do I still hear whispers in the dark, calling my name in voices I recognize? Most disturbing are the dreams. Every night I dream of Savage Mountain, of walking through those impossible forests toward something I can't see but know I must reach. In my dreams, I'm not alone. Thomas is there, and Chloe, and all the others who came before us. We walk together through the endless trees, servants of the mountain's hunger, waiting for the next group of hikers to lose their way. I've moved to California, as far from Maryland as I could get. I've changed my name, my job, my entire life. But I know it doesn't matter. The mountain remembers me, and someday it will call me back. I can feel it in my bones, in the unhealing wounds on my skin, in the whispers that grow louder each night. The mountain is patient. It has all the time in the world, and I'm afraid that someday I won't be strong enough to resist its call. Someday I'll find myself back on that trail, leading another group of innocent hikers into the dark hollow where the trees have faces and the dead walk among the living. The mountain remembers, and it never lets go. I'm writing this account now as a warning, though I doubt anyone will believe it. If you're reading this, stay away from Savage Mountain. Don't trust the maps or the GPS devices. Don't follow the trail markers that lead deeper into the forest. And if you hear whispers in the dark, calling your name in voices you recognize, run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. The mountain is always hungry, and it's always waiting for the next lost soul to wander into its embrace. Don't let it be you. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near Savage River State Forest in western Maryland, where the ancient Appalachian ridges swallow hikers whole and spit out only bones. I should have listened to the locals in Grantsville when they warned us about the old logging trails beyond Meadow Mountain. Should have paid attention when the gas station attendant's face went pale at the mention of Devil's Backbone Ridge. Should have turned back when we found the first set of scratches carved deep into the oak trees, symbols that looked almost like letters. almost like warnings, but not quite human enough to understand. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The trip was supposed to be a reunion of sorts. Me, my college roommate Sarah Rodriguez, and her boyfriend Michael Williams. No relation, despite the shared last name we'd joke about. We'd planned this backpacking expedition for months, poring over topographical maps of the Savage River region, excited about exploring the unmarked trails that promised solitude and untouched wilderness. Sarah had been going through a rough patch after her father's death 6 months prior. The grief had hollowed her out, made her restless and desperate for something, anything, to feel alive again. Michael, bless his heart, thought getting her into nature would help. I wasn't so sure, but I loved them both enough to spend my vacation hiking through tick-infested woods if it meant helping Sarah heal. We started our trek on a Thursday morning in late September, when the leaves were just beginning their autumn surrender. The air carried that crisp bite that promised winter wasn't far behind. Our plan was simple. 3 days, 2 nights, following the old Meadow Mountain loop that would take us past Savage River Falls, up to Devil's Backbone Ridge, and back down through what the locals called Whispering Hollow. The first day went smoothly enough. We made good time along the established trail, stopping to photograph the falls and share energy bars while Sarah talked about her father's love of hiking. Her voice carried a fragile hope I hadn't heard in months, and I felt optimistic about the healing power of wilderness solitude. It was when we turned off the main trail onto the unmarked path toward Devil's Backbone that things began to feel wrong. The forest changed almost immediately. The canopy grew thicker, older, creating a premature twilight even in mid-afternoon. The air became heavy, oppressive, carrying sense of decay and something else, something organic and wet that made my stomach turn. The normal sounds of the forest, bird calls, rustling leaves, distant water, faded to an unnatural silence broken only by our own breathing and footsteps on the moss-covered ground. "This place gives me the creeps," Michael muttered, adjusting his pack straps. He was a big guy, former college football player turned accountant, not easily spooked. Hearing unease in his voice made my own anxiety spike. Sarah, however, seemed energized by the oppressive atmosphere. "It's perfect," she said, her eyes bright with something that wasn't quite right. "Finally, somewhere that matches how I feel inside." I should have paid more attention to that statement. We made camp that evening in a small clearing about halfway up the ridge. The silence was so complete it felt like being wrapped in cotton. Even our fire seemed muted, the crackling wood producing flames that flickered in colors I'd never seen before. Deep purples and sickly greens mixed with the normal orange and yellow. "Must be the mineral content in the wood," Michael said when I mentioned it, but his voice lacked conviction. As darkness fell, the wrongness intensified. Our phones had died despite being fully charged that morning. Michael's GPS unit showed us in impossible locations, sometimes in the middle of Savage River, sometimes floating 300 feet above the ridge. The temperature dropped faster than it should have, and fog began rolling up from the hollow below us, thick and unnatural, carrying whispers that weren't quite wind through leaves. Sarah sat by the fire, staring into the flames with an expression I couldn't read. "Do you hear them?" she asked suddenly. "Hear what?" I replied, though part of me did hear something. Voices too low to understand, coming from the fog that now surrounded our clearing like walls. The voices in the mist, they're calling my name. Michael and I exchanged worried glances. Sarah had been acting strange since we'd turned onto the unmarked trail, but this was different, concerning. "It's just the wind, babe," Michael said gently, moving to sit beside her. "This place is playing tricks on all of us." But it wasn't just the wind. As the night deepened, the whispers grew clearer, more insistent. They seemed to come from just beyond the firelight, circling our camp like predators. Sarah's breathing became shallow and rapid, her eyes never leaving the dancing flames. "I need to go to them," she said around midnight. "They're waiting for me." "Nobody's going anywhere," I said firmly, but even as I spoke I felt the pull myself, a compulsion to walk into that fog, to discover what waited in the darkness beyond. Michael had dozed off despite the strangeness, exhaustion overcoming anxiety. I envied him. Sleep seemed impossible with those voices weaving through the mist, speaking words in a language that felt familiar but remained just beyond comprehension. That's when Sarah stood up. "Sarah, sit down," I hissed, not wanting to wake Michael but desperate to keep her from leaving the circle of firelight. She looked at me then, and what I saw in her eyes made my blood freeze. It wasn't Sarah looking back at me. The intelligence behind those familiar brown eyes was alien, ancient, hungry. Her face wore an expression of terrible joy, like a child anticipating Christmas morning. "They've been waiting so long," she said in a voice that was hers, but somehow wasn't. "Down in the hollow, where the old things sleep. They remember when this land was different, when it belonged to them. They remember the taste." Before I could react, she walked into the fog and vanished. I shook Michael awake, panic making my voice crack. "Sarah's gone." She walked into the fog. He bolted upright, instantly alert. "Which way?" "Toward the hollow." "Michael, something's wrong with her." "Really wrong?" We grabbed our flashlights and followed her trail into the mist. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own feet, but somehow we could follow Sarah's path, not because of footprints or broken branches, but because the whispers grew louder as we moved in the right direction. The voices were clearer now, speaking English mixed with something else, something that predated English by thousands of years. They spoke of hunger, of loneliness, of the long sleep between feedings. They spoke of Sarah like she was a gift, a sacrifice, willing and eager. "Sarah," Michael called out, his voice swallowed by the unnatural fog. "Sarah, come back." We found her in a depression near the bottom of the hollow, standing in a circle of stones so old they were worn smooth. But she wasn't alone. Around her stood figures in the mist, tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs and faces that were almost human but wrong in fundamental ways. Their eyes were black holes in pale faces, and when they smiled, their mouths opened too wide, revealing teeth like broken glass. Sarah stood among them like she belonged there, her head tilted back in ecstasy as they whispered to her in their ancient tongue. As we watched in horror, her skin began to pale, her features sharpening, becoming more like theirs. "What the hell?" Michael started to say, but one of the creatures turned toward us and the words died in his throat. It spoke in Sarah's voice. She came to us willingly. The grief made her empty, and we filled the hollow spaces. She is ours now, as she was always meant to be. Sarah turned toward us then, and I saw what they had done to her. Her eyes were black pits like theirs, her smile too wide, her teeth sharp. But worse than the physical changes was the expression of pure malevolence on what had been my friend's face. "Join us, Jennifer," she said, and her voice echoed with inhuman harmonics. "The hollow is hungry, and you taste like fear." That's when Michael lost it. He charged forward, shouting Sarah's name, trying to reach her through the circle of creatures. The moment he crossed into their space, they fell on him. I won't describe what they did to him. Some images burn themselves so deeply into memory that words only diminish their horror. I'll say only that his screams echoed through the hollow for far too long, and when they finally stopped, what remained wasn't recognizable as human. Sarah watched it all with that terrible smile, and when it was over, she licked her lips with a tongue that was too long and too black. "Now, you understand," she said. "This is what I needed, what I've always needed. The grief was just hunger wearing a mask." I ran. Through the fog, up the slope, crashing through undergrowth and tripping over roots in my desperation to escape. Behind me, I could hear them laughing, sounds like wind through dead leaves, like bones grinding together. But they didn't pursue me. They had what they wanted. I made it back to our camp somehow, grabbed my pack, and kept running. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail as dawn was breaking. My phone miraculously worked again, and I called for help. The search and rescue team found Michael's remains 3 days later, scattered throughout the hollow. They ruled it an animal attack. Bears, they said, though they couldn't explain the precise nature of the wounds or why the bones were arranged in such specific patterns. They never found Sarah, but I know she's still down there, in that circle of stones, waiting with the others for the next grieving soul to stumble into their hollow. Sometimes, on foggy nights, I still hear her voice in the whispers of wind through trees, calling my name, promising that the emptiness inside me could be filled if I'd only come back. I've tried to forget, tried to convince myself it was grief and exhaustion and the tricks that isolation plays on the mind. But then I see the scratches on the trees near my apartment. Symbols that look almost like letters, almost like warnings, but not quite human enough to understand. And I know that some hungers are patient, and some friendships survive even death. The fog is rolling in tonight, and the whispers are getting louder.